We came up with the idea of the 21st century gold rush basically when I was traveling in Morocco and in Turkey. And I just saw different facets of how, for example, in Morocco, all of these women were being trafficked from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe. And that was partially because this new route had opened up and a lot of these trafficking organizations were taking advantage of it. And then in Turkey, I saw how all of these street vendors were selling like life vests and backpacks and all of these things to refugees, anticipating that they were going to be going by boat to Greece. And I just started thinking, wow, this has clearly become an industry, and where else are people making money off of this?
So when Malia came to Highline in the Huffington Post, we thought what an interesting way to approach the story. There had been so much excellent reporting on the refugee crisis already, but no one was really looking at the larger macro impacts of what kind of emerging economies, especially illicit economies, were coming to fruition because of the refugee crisis. Who are these people who are profiting off of this humanitarian crisis? And we decided that the best way to tell this story was through an interactive and kind of multimedia storytelling approach. And that would include writing and video and photo and graphics. So once we had made that decision, we looked at a list of countries where this was going on and picked 4 of them.
So the 4 countries that we settled on were Niger, and then Italy, and then Turkey, and then Germany. And basically each of these countries represent a different piece of the puzzle. So in Niger, we picked Agadez simply because this was one of the key areas that lots of people were going through to get to Italy, and it was where this entire black market economy had emerged to support migration.
So what we were expecting to find when we went to Niger were these massive movements of migrants that other journalists had, well, documented. What we didn't expect to find was that there was mass human trafficking, sex trafficking, and drugs that were coming up through Africa onto Libya and onto Europe, and weapons that were coming down the other way and fueling all of the conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was really surprising to us, and our work there really looked to identify how the system was functioning. And then we moved on to Sicily.
So basically in Sicily, of course, the Mafia, the Cosa Nostra, has been there for a really long time. And in recent years, they've been fading because there's been a lot of very high-level arrests that put a lot of key people in jail. Then the refugee crisis happened, and that changed everything because suddenly there were these new groups of people from Nigeria and these cults called the Black Axe. And what we found was that the Sicilian Mafia and the Black Axe ended up having this kind of mutual symbiosis where the Black Axe basically ended up being kind of the lower level labor force for Cosa Nostra, but then they both ended up making a lot of money off of this relationship and also off of the way they exploited refugees, both women and men.
And then we moved on to Turkey. And in Turkey, we knew that the Syrian refugee crisis had really made an impact there because they had the largest population of Syrian refugees. And these refugees were providing cheap labor and a sort of underground economy in the country. What we were more surprised to find was the extent of child labor in Turkey. So many Syrian children are not able to find access to education, and so the majority of them end up working in sweatshops in very poor conditions. But a lot of the time, this can be the only income for their family, so it can be a necessary evil.
And then on the border with Syria, we looked at the businessmen who moved from Aleppo to Turkey and were creating new business opportunities for refugees, and also the people who were playing an intermediary role to make sure that life-saving goods like food and baby formula were able to get from Turkey into Syria for the population that depended on them.
And finally, we moved to Germany, where we were looking at the privatization of refugee care and specifically looking at housing and security.
One of the interesting parts of Germany was how much it changed from the beginning to the end when so many people were coming in to, say, Berlin, and the government didn't really have the capacity to support them, and so they started giving out these vouchers, and there was this free-for-all where people would just open up their homes, turning them into hostels, expecting to get the money that the government had given for refugees. And eventually it became more professionalized and a bit more organized, but there was still some problems in terms of exploitation and the conditions that people would be living in.
So overall, we put these 4 countries in spotlights together to really understand the broader implications of the refugee crisis on these economic systems.